Good evening and welcome to the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre webinar and award presentations for 2020. Thank you for joining us. We are expecting somewhere in the order of 120 people to join us this evening, and I'm pleased to say a bit of an international flavour with people coming in from Canada, Europe and perhaps even Australia. I am Mike Almond, the Forces in Mind Trust Professor of Veterans and Family Studies at Anglia Ruskin University. And tonight we will showcase the prize-winning research activity supported by FiMT and primarily performed in 2019. Under normal circumstances, these presentations would have formed part of our March 2020 conference, which is now rescheduled for March 2021 for obvious reasons. But we felt it important that this work should be highlighted and rewarded within the year. We will all shortly have 3 pre-recorded presentations from our prize winners, followed by a live panel question and answer session. First, a little housekeeping. Although I'm sure we're all experts now in Zoom meetings and webinars, you will note that your microphones and cameras are turned off by our hosts. However, the chat box is open and you can direct questions to my colleagues Alex Cooper and Chris Flutie in the Research Centre, who later on will email me a collection or a collation of appropriate questions to put to our prize winners. I've got technical assistance this afternoon from Kitty Walker from the contact group and colleagues at the Research Centre. You're quite at liberty to log in and out during the evening if there's problems, and if there is a catastrophic failure, please allow us 5 minutes and log back in and we'll be there. Before I introduce our first award winner, Ray Locke, Air Vice Marshal Ray Locke, Chief Executive of Forces in Mind Trust, has sent in a few words.
Good evening, I'm Ray Locke, I'm Chief Executive of the Forces in Mind Trust, and I just want to pass on the congratulations of the board of Forces in Mind Trust and of course all the staff here to Lisa, to Chérie and to Meri for being the prize winners in 2020, and also to promise you that your prize, which will be a signed copy of Emily Mayhew's excellent book, A Heavy Reckoning, is genuinely in the post. But thanks for this evening and congratulations again.
Thank you, Ray. I can recommend the book. I have a very small part in that little book in one of the tables in there. On to our award winners. Our first award winner is Professor Lisa Scullion. Lisa is a Professor of Social Policy at the University of Salford, leading and developing research which focuses on welfare, poverty, disability and military transitions. Lisa and her team have received several grants from FiMT, and today Professor Scullion is being awarded the Forces in Mind Trust Research Award. This award is for impact. Her report sanctions, support and service leavers, welfare, conditionality and transition from civilian to military life demonstrated unparalleled authoritative and credible evidence to government, both national and local, upon which to act to support the ex-service community. Lisa, FiMT is delighted to present you with this award this evening. And we can now go over to Lisa's video.
Hello, my name is Lisa Scullion and I'm Professor of Social Policy at the University of Salford. I'm proud to be here this evening to represent the Sanctions Support and Service Leavers Project team. And it is a real privilege to share a platform with 2 inspirational women whose work is also being recognised this evening. I wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to the Forces in Mind Trust and to the Veterans and Families Research Hub, and to say what a real honour it is for our project to receive the Research Award. But I also wanted to say a huge thank you to all of those who contributed to our project, and in particular the veterans and their families who spoke to us about their experiences. As a team, we've been studying the benefit system for many years, and we are aware of how stigmatising being a benefit claimant can be. But we have learned through this project that this stigma can be particularly acute for those who have served in the armed forces, where claiming benefits might be perceived as a failure in the transition to civilian life. But for us, claiming benefits isn't a sign of failure. And if we go back to Beveridge and the development of our post-war welfare state, this was about recognising the sacrifices people had made during the war and making adequate provisions around health, education, housing, employment. But also central to those provisions was a comprehensive social security benefit system that would support people during times of need. But we seem to have moved quite far from some of those ideas. Now, this slide isn't an exhaustive list of policy, but I wanted to use it to illustrate what appear to be two parallel worlds that have developed over the last decade. On the one hand, in terms of veteran support, there has been an increasing emphasis on supporting those who have served in the armed forces. We have the Armed Forces Covenant, we have the Strategy for our Veterans, and we have the new Office for Veterans Affairs. But at the exact same time, during that exact same period, we are also experiencing the most fundamental reform since the development of the post-war welfare state. We have the Welfare Reform Act and the introduction of universal credit, which will eventually replace all of the other main out-of-work benefits in the UK. These reforms have been met with some significant criticism, particularly in relation to some of the more punitive aspects, such as the benefit cap, the reductions in benefits levels, and the increased use of benefits sanctions for what are often perceived as relatively minor transgressions. And in some ways, I think it can be quite difficult to reconcile these reforms with the commitments made in the veterans policy world that emphasise lifelong support for people. So for us, it's really important to bridge these two worlds, because debates around how service leavers experience social security benefits are equally as important as debates around health, employment, housing, etc. And when we approached the Forces in Mind Trust with our proposal in 2016, which feels like a very long time ago now, we were incredibly grateful that they also shared our viewpoint on the importance of a study on the benefits system. And our project represents the first substantive qualitative research to focus on veterans' experiences within that system. And as well as flying the flag for the importance of studying social security, we are also flying the flag for the importance of qualitative research in evidence-based policy making and the value of those approaches. Our project involved consultation with a range of key stakeholders. We were able to undertake focus groups with the Department for Work and Pension staff. But the most important aspect of our project was qualitative longitudinal research with veterans who are navigating through the benefits system. Because to truly understand how policies are experienced on the ground, we believe you need to speak to those who are actually at the sharp end of those policies. And also, by taking a longitudinal approach, we were able to move beyond a snapshot of one point in time, which was incredibly valuable when you are looking at a system that is in transition, because it enabled us to look at how people experience their transitions within that benefit system, which is something that I'll come back to later. So we're obviously short on time this evening, and our project covered a whole range of issues. So to a certain extent, I have had to just select some of the key issues to talk about. So the first is around accessing the benefits system. Many participants described the complexity of navigating the system, and confusion and misunderstanding were typical experiences for people. It was evident that for many people, this was their first encounter with the benefits system, and they were not prepared for it. And that benefits was not something that was really discussed when people were leaving the armed forces. As such, we recommended that information on the benefits system needed to be routinely provided as part of the resettlement information. The second point is around the support provided within the system. We found significant variation in the approach of staff within job centres when people disclosed that they had been in the armed forces and when they talked about their armed forces background. This varied from those who have experienced really positive approaches from work coaches and from job centre staff, through to those who appeared to have experienced a lack of respect. And it very much depended on the individual work coach and how they approached working with benefit claimants. We felt very strongly that this inconsistency in support is something that needed addressing. We would like to think that veterans can go into any job centre and know that when they talk about their experiences, that they will be appropriately supported and appropriately signposted to the relevant support. The third key issue relates to how we assess people with mental and physical health conditions, and this was a significant concern within the research. Within the UK benefits system, people with health conditions or disabilities have to undergo a work capability assessment when claiming benefits. And this assessment asks a series of questions, and the outcome of this assessment determines the level of benefits and whether there are expectations to look for work. And there were three significant concerns about these assessments. The first was around whether the assessors were suitably qualified to assess the health conditions that were attributed to service. And there appeared to be a particular lack of understanding around mental health. People often described going to assessments where they had been asked whether they could raise their arm or whether they'd been able to walk to the appointment. Questions around mental health and how this could impact on people's day-to-day lives appeared to be absent. The second was that service medical or other supporting information was not always feeding into this assessment process. So somebody could have medical records and reports written about their health conditions, but for some reason, these were not being taken into that assessment process. Now, with these two issues, what we found was that people were being incorrectly assessed as fit for work. And with that came an expectation that they would very quickly find a job. And I say incorrectly, as what happened was these outcomes were often appealed with the support of armed forces charities and other advocates, and then overturned. And what happened was people were then placed within the correct disability benefit category. But this was a long and stressful process for people. And this links to a third concern about the assessment process that our research highlighted. And this is the fact that for some people, actually going through this process and the fear of the outcome of this assessment process could actually exacerbate people's ill health. So we recommended an urgent review of the assessment process to ensure that benefits assessors are suitably trained and qualified, and to ensure that this process doesn't result in exacerbating people's health conditions. One of the final key points I wanted to mention this evening that we make in our research returns to what I mentioned at the beginning around welfare reform and acknowledging that this is a system that is currently in transition. Universal credit is replacing existing benefits, and across the UK, people are being moved from the old system to the new. And this process will be going on until 2023, I believe. Now, on this slide, I've included some quotes from a participant that we call David. And David's story really illustrates many of the issues that I've raised in this presentation. David left service a number of years ago. He had quite complex needs. He had mental and physical health issues. He had experienced homelessness. And when we first interviewed him, he was actually living in temporary accommodation, which was a specific housing scheme for veterans. Despite his ongoing mental health issues, plus the fact he had also had a heart attack, he had initially been assessed as being fit for work. But he had subsequently been reassessed with support and then moved to the appropriate disability benefit. It was also evident that with the wraparound support that was provided as part of his veteran-specific accommodation, he had experienced improvements in his mental health and a sense of financial stability with his benefit claims. But we visited him 12 months later, 12 months after that first interview. Now, he had moved into his own independent accommodation, which was great, and he was really enjoying moving out of the supported accommodation into his own place. But with that move, he had been transferred to universal credit, and David's account highlighted the disruption to his sense of stability that had occurred following this transition to universal credit. And this included confusion about reduced payments, but also the replacement of some of the more positive face-to-face interactions with digital interactions. And thinking back to the point that I made earlier about parallel worlds, it's really easy to see in David's case the positive support that was being provided to him as a veteran that has helped him with his health and with his housing, with other aspects of his life. But our longitudinal approach also showed how easy it is for people's progress to be disrupted when you are then faced with a less personalised system. And this can have unintended consequences for people's health and well-being. So I started the presentation with some thanks, and I want to end on some thanks as well. And I want to say a thank you to the Armed Forces team at the Department for Work and Pensions. I think it's fair to say that there was some initial reluctance to engage with our project. And I think it's also fair to say that we were tenacious in our efforts to build that relationship with the DWP. So we are very proud that our relationship with them has developed to a position where they have listened to the research and responded to our findings and recommendations. And I just wanted to flag up some of the impact of the research. So firstly, recognising that the benefits advice isn't consistently being provided to service leavers, the DWP and the MOD have committed to working collaboratively to produce guidance on the benefits system as part of the resettlement support. The DWP have also updated their district provision tools to ensure that support relevant to the Armed Forces community is included and up to date. Now, these tools are the resources that the work coaches use for signposting benefit claimants to any other relevant support locally or nationally that they might need. Significantly, benefits assessors are now also currently looking at a training module to help assess the specific mental and physical health issues related to service in the armed forces. And finally, the DWP were able to use the research to help support a £5 million investment from the government to enhance their Armed Forces Champions network. These are significant and welcome commitments that have been made. But for us, this research really represents a beginning rather than an end point. We have produced a piece of research that highlights some significant concerns, and these commitments have been made. But the next stage is supporting the delivery of these commitments and being able to look at the impact of these investments. We are therefore really looking forward to being able to continue our partnership with the Forces in Mind Trust and the Department for Work and Pensions to ensure that the needs of the armed forces community remain a consideration as the benefits system reforms. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. for your work, and your final impact slide more than demonstrates why you're a worthy winner of the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre Award for Impact. We look forward to seeing you later on this evening. Our next award winner is Professor Chérie Armour. Chérie is the Professor of Psychological Trauma and Mental Health in the Department of Psychology at Queen's University, Belfast. Chérie has a particular interest in occupational groups who are exposed to trauma, which obviously includes veterans. She has published over 150 research papers and has received several grants from FiMT. Today, Chérie and her team are presented with the Lord Ashcroft Research Award. Lord Ashcroft was obviously the author of the Veterans Transition Review and is the Chancellor of Anglia Ruskin University, and therefore continues to be interested in the work of the academics in the veterans sphere. This award tonight is for Chérie's programme of work. That is related to those veterans living in Northern Ireland and its potential for future impact. Working in the unique environment of Northern Ireland, Professor Armour's Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study has already identified the need for increased trust, statutory support, and the targeted resources that the veterans in Northern Ireland require. We look forward not only to her talk this evening, but for further reports and recommendations, which I know are in the pipeline. Could we now see Chérie's video?
Hi, I am Chérie Armour and I'm a Professor of Psychological Trauma and Mental Health. I'm based in the School of Psychology at Queen's University, Belfast, and I'm really happy to be one of the 2020 award recipients and to have an opportunity to share our research with you. So today I'll speak to you about the Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study. Okay, so before I discuss the Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study, I think it's important to provide some context into why this research is so important for those veterans who live in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, as you know, is one of the 4 nations within the United Kingdom, alongside Scotland, England and Wales. And as I'm sure many of you already know, the population of Northern Ireland did experience a prolonged period of political conflict, which was colloquially termed the Troubles. As a result of the Troubles and the mass violence within the country between 2 opposing religious groups, Catholics who desired a united Ireland and Protestants who desired to remain as part of the UK, the British Army deployed to Northern Ireland as a peacekeeping exercise in support of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, now called the Police Service of Northern Ireland. This operation was termed Operation Banner, and it actually lasted 38 years, which means that it's the longest operation within the history of the British Army. In 1972, the troop strength was 28,000 army personnel deployed on the streets of Northern Ireland, which at the time had a population size of 1.6 million. So comparatively speaking, that's quite a significant number of boots on the ground. An important point to understand is that the troops in Northern Ireland were a mix of regular army personnel who were ordinarily resident in England, Scotland or Wales, plus several battalions of Home Services personnel. Indeed, many residents who had grown up in Northern Ireland actually grew up and joined the army as members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, the UDR, then later as members of the Royal Irish Regiment. During military service, those individuals in the Home Services lived and often worked second jobs in communities in which they also served, and as a result transitioned to post-military to those same communities in which they saw active combat. Many veterans from the Home Services in Northern Ireland would say that they were on a continuous deployment because of the active combat nature of their role, despite never actually leaving the country. These unique circumstances are believed to have had an adverse impact on health and well-being. For example, veterans residing in Northern Ireland do so under both a subjective and at times objective sense of threat through security and safety concerns from remaining paramilitary organisations. As a psychologist, we understand that threat perception can actually be hugely impactful on someone's psychological health and well-being. And to date, evidence exists from a series of qualitative interviews that my team have conducted, showing that safety and security are still very much in the consciousness of veterans and their families, and that many struggle with help seeking and psychological difficulties as a legacy of the Northern Ireland Troubles. This is further intensified and maintained due to regular incidences of paramilitary activity within the country, some of which has resulted in the deaths of soldiers, prison officers and police officers, all seem to be part of the state and therefore working for the UK government. I make these points not to try to sensationalise the situation in Northern Ireland, but to try to provide understanding or a rationale as to why many of our veterans live under a continuous veil of threat perception with heightened concerns for the safety of themselves and their families. So because of all the socio-political issues and challenges of researching the health and well-being of this population, in addition to the fact that the population themselves are referred to as being hidden and hard to reach for some very obvious reasons, there had been no research conducted with the group until we began our programme of work in early 2016. And indeed, several official reports from the MOD and other research teams had explicitly stated that Northern Ireland, as one of the 4 nations, was not included in the research due to the nuances of the socio-political context. Thankfully, we received funding from Forces in Mind Trust to take forward a programme of research in this area. Indeed, we were actually successful in 2 funding applications, and these were later merged into the Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study. The Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study is now in its final year, and so as you can imagine, there's been a lot of research conducted to date, and a lot more than what I can go into in any detail in a 15-minute talk. So I'll try to use the next few slides just to summarise what we've done, and then I can take some questions at the end. So our first work package focused on scoping out all of the various support available to veterans in Northern Ireland and how they communicated with each other, so how various supports communicated across each other. In summary, we found only 19 veteran-orientated charitable organisations in Northern Ireland, and this was actually in pretty stark contrast to the 1,818 that were found in England and Wales and the 419 that are present currently in Scotland. Informal relationships for referrals were found to be highly prevalent, with lots of overlapping membership on key committees. There was also a lack of focused mental health service provision, and significant security and safety concerns were regularly raised around engagement with support services. Our work therefore called for a centralised, independent coordinating body, and thankfully this has now been put in place, and we have the Veterans Support Office, which is in part funded by Westminster. We also wanted to understand what both veterans and service providers felt were the current and future support needs within the veteran community in Northern Ireland. Time and time again, we had heard about all the barriers that exist for veterans in Northern Ireland when they try to seek help so that they can receive support. So for example, barriers were reported as the stigma that veterans feel exists around the military within Northern Ireland and also around having a mental health condition. Many reported safety and security concerns related to disclosure and a lack of trust in the non-military health professionals for some of those very same reasons. So we called for focused efforts on improving community integration of veterans and public awareness training around various issues that veterans might experience as a way to try to mitigate some of that stigma. We also produced a report on the need for a dedicated Veterans Centre in Northern Ireland. We explored what this would look like, what support should be available, where it should be located, and who should be able to use it, and so on. We found overwhelming support amongst the veterans, but not from the service providers. The top reasons that veterans would use the centre were for mental health support, social activities, education and training. Veterans said that there was a need for a safe space and that it should be staffed by current or former military personnel. Service providers said that a designated centre wasn't required and argued that it may cause some dependency. So there were competing views as to whether a centre was required or not. We had repeatedly heard reports from military veterans and from service providers that said that the military and veteran community in Northern Ireland were hated by most, or at best half, of the population. So because of this, we conducted a piece of research into the public attitudes to the armed forces in Northern Ireland. Our results concluded that 42% of the population actually had a high or very high opinion of the armed forces community, and that only 12% had a low or very low opinion of them as it stands today. Overall, 77% of the population said it would support a specialist mental health service in Northern Ireland for veterans who lived in the region, which actually supports the veteran centre concept that we've just mentioned. Results did, however, vary according to religion and age, with Catholics and younger respondents being least likely to have a positive opinion about the UK Armed Forces. Right now, we're working on finalising our report on the Psychological Wellbeing Survey. This is our most recent work package that we've completed. This was a cross-sectional online survey of UK Armed Forces veterans who were currently residing in Northern Ireland at the time of completing the survey. Recruitment was through a variety of means, including event attendance, public engagement, local veteran organisations, through a dedicated social media campaign, and through a variety of newspaper ads. We were quite proud of our response rate because we had 1,329 veterans provide consent. Now, of course, like any type of psychological wellbeing survey that gets administered, there's variable levels of missing data across measures, but as a full cohort, we tend to have about 800 completed surveys. Now I'd just quickly like to show you one of our recruitment tools. So we developed an animation to assist us with recruiting veterans who are resident in Northern Ireland. I should quickly flag that this project commenced in 2016 at Ulster University, and then we transitioned the team to Queen's University in Belfast. So the animation does refer to Ulster University.
Are you a veteran who served in the British Armed Forces? And are you currently living in Northern Ireland? Then we want to hear from you. Compared to England, Scotland and Wales, we don't know very much about the needs of veterans living in Northern Ireland. So, a team of researchers from Ulster University are running an online survey to learn about what life after military service is like for veterans in this country. We want to hear from anyone who previously served in the Army, Navy or Air Force, either as a regular or in the reserves. From your responses, we'll learn about the current and future needs of the veteran community and identify potential barriers to accessing services. Ultimately, we want to get a picture of the health and well-being of veterans in Northern Ireland. Your responses are private and confidential, as well as completely anonymous. Everything we learn from this anonymised information will be passed on to local services to help them understand and meet veteran needs in the future. This will enable those who served this country to live happier and healthier lives. By taking part in the survey, you could win an Amazon gift card worth £150. So what are you waiting for? It's time to get your voice heard. Click the link below to complete the survey today.
As I've just mentioned, we've recently completed the data collection and the data analysis of our psychological wellbeing study, and we have finalised a methodology paper describing the survey and the main results. In this methodology paper, we present some information about the prevalence rates of various psychological disorders and a whole array of different things. So we hope to get that under review soon for publication. We've also been working on a number of other papers. So for example, we have been working on a paper assessing the rates and predictors of common mental disorders and PTSD in younger versus older veterans who live in Northern Ireland. And we have conducted the analysis for a series of papers that looks at predictors of poor community reintegration and how poor community reintegration impacts on current health and wellbeing. We have also completed in full a paper that examines the nuanced relationships between PTSD and alcohol symptoms and why people who experience PTSD might have a higher likelihood of having an alcohol use disorder. And we are also looking in detail at alcohol's role in help seeking for mental health issues through a PhD project. And there's many, many more papers to come from the data that we've collected through the large-scale psychological wellbeing survey. So I wanted to finish this presentation up by talking about the research impact, or the impact that we've generated specifically from the research evidence that we've created. So as I mentioned earlier on, our very first report called for a centralised coordinating body to support veterans in Northern Ireland, and now we have a brand new Veterans Support Office which is part funded by Westminster. Our work also resulted in discussions that finalised in the revision to the title, the role and the responsibility of local council armed forces champions, and these are now called Veterans Champions, which makes much more sense because they deal with veterans issues. There has been a working group set up in collaboration with the Veterans Support Office to look at a bespoke Veterans Centre and to basically commence discussions on how that would be best taken forward. We have provided groundbreaking insights into public perceptions and attitudes of the military in Northern Ireland. And actually what we've done there, we hope, is break down some of those barriers and reduce some of that stigma around the public perceptions and the military in Northern Ireland specifically. Myself and Dr. Bethany Waterhouse-Bradley have both presented to the Defence Select Committee, so we've presented oral evidence on 2 separate occasions, which is really nice to be able to do that and be at the table alongside our colleagues from England, Scotland and Wales. And related to that, we're also having a lot more involvement in national level studies. So typically prior to us starting this work, studies focused on the 3 nations. So studies focused on Scotland, Wales and England, and Northern Ireland was often left out essentially because it was felt to be too much of a complex situation. But now we're able to partner in those studies, which gives a 4-nation perspective, which is immensely invaluable. We also have a new, for the very first time, Veterans Champion just appointed here in Northern Ireland. So we'll be liaising and collaborating closely with the Veterans Champion and looking forward to working alongside the Champion so that we can essentially improve the situation for our veterans here in Northern Ireland. So in conclusion, I just want to make a couple of final points. I think it's important to acknowledge that post-service adjustment to civilian life is affected by someone's military history, and this has implications for both the military and post-military interventions that are aimed at mitigating potentially difficult transition experiences. Veterans in Northern Ireland have experienced a unique military history that must be considered in this context, even for those who are transitioning now and planning to settle in Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, the Northern Ireland Troubles has a legacy for those veterans who are residing in Northern Ireland now in current day. The Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study does provide the first formal evidence base on which we can expand our understanding about the population and on which we can ensure appropriate and accessible support for those who need it. Our preliminary evidence from the psychological wellbeing study has demonstrated that there is a high proportion of mental health concerns, including depression, anxiety and PTSD within the veteran population in Northern Ireland. But I must caveat that statement by saying that the research is not representative of the whole population. However, the rates are still concerning. Okay, so I hope that was insightful and it gives you a good idea of our programme of research that is the Northern Ireland Veterans Health and Wellbeing Study. Just to finish off and say that I'm really delighted that this programme of research has been one of the award recipients in 2020.
Chérie, thank you very much indeed for your presentation this evening, and the impact slide again demonstrates that you've moved Northern Ireland from what was probably the too difficult box into the work in progress. And although this award goes for future impact, I think you've more than adequately demonstrated that impact has already been shown from the work that you've performed. Before I move on to the third and final award winner, could I remind you that the Q&A and chat boxes are open. They're not visible to the rest of the attendees online. They're only seen by the Research Centre staff, and any questions you wish to raise will be anonymous and will be presented to our speakers at the end of the evening. Our third and special award goes to Meri Mayhew. Meri probably exemplifies what FiMT is all about. Someone who has had a highly successful transition from the military to civilian life. She left the Royal Air Force after 14 years service, where she worked as an air traffic controller, and at one point was running air traffic ops in Kabul. After leaving the RAF, she moved into the charity sector and completed a higher degree. She then moved to work for FiMT and later became the head of policy there. In 2019, Meri was seconded to the UK government's team charged with creating the first, and some would say the belated, strategy for our veterans. Meri researched the armed forces charity sector and wrote a supporting paper entitled "The UK Armed Forces Charity Sector, a Summary of Provision." This played a significant part in shaping the strategy, directly bringing to bear her experience at FiMT and acting as the interlocutor between government and armed forces charities. In recognition of the strategic impact of Meri's research, as well as her broader influence work, the Board of Forces in Mind Trust has decided this year to grant a special award for FIMPACT. Meri, we are very pleased to virtually present you with this special award.
Hello. I'd like to start by thanking the Forces in Mind Trust for this very special and greatly appreciated award. So thank you very much. By way of my background, I served in the Royal Air Force as an air traffic control officer for just over 12 years. And I've worked in the charity sector since leaving. Initially, I was chief executive of a non-military charity for 3 years, before moving into the military charity sector to work at Forces in Mind Trust for 6 years in 2 different roles. From there, I was seconded into the Ministry of Defence to work as charity advisor to the Veterans Strategy, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And since my secondment finished, I've worked self-employed as a consultant in the charity sector, continuing to work in a charity sector I greatly enjoy. I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about the Veterans Strategy. The strategy for our veterans is a government strategy which was produced in 2018, with all 4 nations of the UK contributing to deliver this strategy. The fact that this level of collaboration was achieved really showed the strong support and recognition of the importance of veterans in all communities across the UK. It was, in fact, the first ever UK-wide government strategy. So the strategy sets out the intent for the UK to be the best place in the world to be a veteran, as this vision shows. It refers to a smooth transition from military to civilian life for veterans and their families, and then contributing to a society that values what they've done and what they have to offer. And the 3 principles in the strategy draw on these strategic objectives further. The first principle draws on the benefit that we know veterans bring to society. The second principle talks about veterans maximising their potential as civilians. And the final principle is about providing the additional support for veterans who need it. And I think it was really important to get this vision and this balance right. We know that the vast majority of veterans have a successful transition to civilian life and go on to have fulfilled lives and contribute very positively to society. But some veterans, for a variety of reasons, do need additional support. So it was very important that this was included in the strategy, but without dominating it. So while the vision and principles are applicable across all sectors of the UK, as a government strategy, it focuses primarily on the public sector across all areas, setting the delivery of public services for veterans in all areas. And this is to ensure that veterans feel more valued, it's supported and empowered. The strategy is structured around 5 cross-cutting factors, including things such as collaboration and public perception. And then also 6 key themes, such as housing, employment and finance. So the strategy covers every aspect of provision and all the areas affecting veterans' lives. Now, so far I've talked about the focus on public services, as veterans are, of course, civilians and citizens of the state. But here in the UK, we are really fortunate to have a strong and vibrant armed forces charity sector. This charity sector supplements the core essential services of the public sector by providing additional and bespoke services. The vital importance of this sector brings me on to talk about my role in the strategy. So the idea of having a representative from, from the charity sector as part of the Veterans Strategy team was initiated by COBSIO, the Confederation of Service Charities. It was also felt important that the post was funded and resourced from within the charitable sector to maintain that independence from government and represent the best interests of the charity sector. So the post was kindly funded by the Forces in Mind Trust. I was seconded into this role from June 2018 and was very grateful for the support of the COBSIO Executive Committee and the board and chief executive of the Forces in Mind Trust, also for their guidance throughout my secondment. I worked as part of a dedicated veterans strategy team of 4 people in the Ministry of Defence, working under the Ministerial Covenant and Veterans Board. My role was to bring my knowledge and experience of the very significant contribution made by the Armed Forces charity sector to this important strategy. And this felt like a great privilege to me as a position, but also a great responsibility. This is a sector with a long history, a turnover of around £1 billion a year, helping tens of thousands of people across every area of support, not to mention some fairly strong characters working within the sector. And so I needed to be sure that I could do that justice. But it was also a fantastic opportunity for me to understand the situation from another perspective, in this case, the public sector. I was able to understand the workings, issues and opportunities of the public sector, which I found fascinating and from which I learned a great deal. It was a real eye-opening experience. As we drafted the strategy, I assisted and contributed as fully and as fairly as possible. I also coordinated the input of the Veterans Strategy Charities Group and liaised closely with this group throughout. As part of my role, I was also tasked to produce a summary of provision by the UK Armed Forces charity sector. And this was quite a daunting task, I must admit, to be able to produce a summary which all of my colleagues in the charity sector could subscribe to. So to try and address this in my methodology, I used evidence about the sector as much as possible. So this included drawing on the Directory of Social Change Sector Insight reports, among others, so that my summary was evidence-based as much as possible rather than opinion and anecdote. But I also wanted to give a flavour of the trends and risks in the sector, and I drew on the views of key stakeholders for this part of the report. So in the first part of my report, I included an overview of the sector. So the types and numbers of charities, the beneficiaries supported, and the breadth of support. I wrote about the exemplary levels of collaboration and coordination which exist within the sector. I included a financial overview, made reference of the support to the armed forces community from civilian charities, and then finally several charity sector trends and risks. Unfortunately, a global pandemic wasn't foreseen as one at that stage. The second part of my report covered charity sector by theme, and this linked with the key themes in the veterans strategy that I'd referred to earlier. And I also included sections about charity sector provision in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to give a reflection of the differences across the 4 home nations of the UK. As a summary of provision, my report did not set out to make recommendations, but I did make an overriding recommendation that the government should continue, the UK government and the devolved administrations, continue to support the work of the armed forces charity sector as much as possible. My report was well received, and as well as helping to inform the veterans strategy, it has, I hope, provided a useful overview for people not familiar with the work of the sector. So in November 2018, the UK, Welsh and Scottish governments jointly published the strategy for our veterans. My summary was also hosted on the same government page and printed in hard copy. And then about a week later, there were simultaneous debates on the strategy in the House of Lords and House of Commons. Perhaps the timing of November 2018 was slightly unfortunate, coinciding as it did with a Brexit debate and vote. But the strategy still received significant attention, perhaps offering a less contentious distraction. The consultation process on the strategy followed, and I joined some of the consultation events around the UK. Leading on from my contribution to the veterans strategy, and as part of the consultation, I was commissioned to carry out a further review into how collaboration and coordination could be improved between the public and charity sectors. Collaboration and coordination had been identified as 2 of the most important cross-cutting factors of the strategy. I completed my review in March 2019, making a large number of recommendations. Though this review had never been intended for publication, I was very pleased to see some of my recommendations picked up in the government response which was published earlier this year. One specific example has been the establishment of a charity-facing post within the Ministry of Defence as a means of achieving greater collaboration. To conclude, I'm absolutely delighted to have received this award for my role and my work as charity advisor to the Veterans Strategy. And I hope I've provided a useful overview of my role and what I was able to achieve within it. Thank you.
Meri, thanks again. A tremendous piece of work there, and especially important linking the charity sector into the veteran strategy. I don't think one could really work without the other. We'll see you in a second when we get all our speakers back online, if they could or want to now unmute their mics and put on their cameras. Once again, I can remind you the question and answer session is available, and you can, by using the Q&A buttons, alert my colleagues in the Research Centre, who will then email me some questions. We've had some already, and as you can expect from awards that reward impact, the first question which I will throw out there, and I'll pick on Lisa to answer first, but I will direct them to all our winners today. And having won an award for impact, what advice could you give to researchers or a research organisation who wish to have research impact? Lisa.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks again for the honour of the award. I mean, I said in my presentation that we were quite tenacious in our pursuit of the relationship we had with the kind of key policy stakeholders, which are those at the DWP. In terms of my advice, I think part of the success of that relationship was not to be always criticising them. So look, there was a lot of negative stuff in our report, but we didn't want that to overshadow the good work that was being delivered by the DWP. So with all the kind of conversations we had with them, and within our report and the two reports that we published, we also emphasised where there was significant good practice that could be built upon. Because I think if you come from a position where it feels like policymakers are just being attacked and everything is being criticised all the time, it's not a very positive basis for having that kind of research impact. I also think, again, I'm kind of flying the flag for the longitudinal approach, because that was really helpful for building the relationship. So we could establish that relationship with the policymakers quite early on. They could have access to interim findings and start making responses in relation to the interim findings. So then by the time the project comes to the end, you've got that really kind of solid relationship.
Thank you, Lisa. I think longitudinal is hard and difficult and somewhat expensive, but it is the thing that bears probably the most fruit. Chérie, can we turn to you and ask you the same question about how would you advise somebody who wished to achieve impact through their research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I second what Lisa has said, and a lot of it is generally based on that relationship building piece. But I think it's so important to develop these plans at the very outset of any research project, and to make sure that your kind of impact generation plans are at the heart of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So for example, make sure that you've got the appropriate stakeholders at advisory groups, make sure you're attending appropriate meetings at appropriate events, and you're talking to people and properly disseminating the information that's going out. But in the context of our project, we had some kind of nuances, given that we were based in Northern Ireland and we were trying to tap into what's a hidden and hard to reach population. And therefore, we really started that relationship building piece very, very early. And by that, I mean, we actually did a piece of research 2 years before we secured the funding from Forces in Mind Trust to actually ask the veterans themselves, what research do you need us to do in order to cause that impact for the benefit of the Veteran Society in Northern Ireland. So it's a much longer term plan, and often much longer than the actual project itself. So if the project is 4 years, your impact plan should maybe be 6 years. So you have to top and tail the impact. So that would be my kind of top tip.
I think what I take home from there is to put impact into the beginning of the process, and don't assume it will just fall out at the end.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Meri, over to you with the same question.
Good evening, everyone. I think it's quite challenging to be able to achieve impact on research, because you are wanting people to change something, to do something differently, and that requires, I think, a really strong convincing argument and a really clear setting out of the benefits of making those changes so that people will take those forward. So I think being really clear on the benefits and setting out a strong case for the change, and also then setting out how that can be achieved clearly to make it as easy as possible for people receiving that research to see the benefits that can come from it and how they can make that happen.
And having it discussed in the House of Lords probably doesn't hurt.
No, not at all.
Lisa, I've got a question. If I can just find it on the technology here being emailed in. And the question is, Lisa, your excellent research very much highlights the continued lack of understanding which exists now. Back in the 1960s, a lot of the people who would have worked in DWP or its equivalent, or employers, would have been ex-forces personnel themselves and would have understood a veteran. Nowadays, that's not the case, and very few people would understand that. So could you speak a little bit more to what you identified in terms of the education piece, particularly related to job centre staff, the question asks, in what being a veteran who is unemployed or in need of welfare is, as opposed to an unemployed civilian? What does that mean?
Okay, yeah, that is an excellent question, an excellent issue, and it is one that we provided a recommendation on within the report. I mean, as I flagged up in the presentation, what we were finding this significant variation kind of across different geographical areas, but even within an individual job centre, it very much depends on the person you get, the training they've had and how they will approach dealing with people who are sitting at their desk and going through their benefits claims. The concern for us is that it shouldn't be that way. You should be able to go in and have consistent support wherever you are in the country, or whichever job centre that you are going into. So we did recommend that the DWP should be providing training across all their staff around this kind of the specific considerations and specific understanding around the armed forces community, some of the experiences people may have had, and some of the support needs that may be there. This was something that we did recommend. And we also felt that there's a role here for the DWP Armed Forces Champions. Now, at the time we did the research, this role appeared to be, there were those that were delivering very well and providing some really fantastic support. But again, there were those where people didn't even know who their Armed Forces Champion was or how to contact them. So there was a kind of invisibility in other areas. Again, we were concerned about that. But some of the Armed Forces Champions themselves talked about how it was a role that was added to existing roles. No specific training was provided. Some people just kind of learned the role on the job. So for us, we had recommended to the DWP that kind of it needs to be appropriately resourced. It's an important issue that they need resources for, an important role that needs resourcing, but also kind of that staff training should be provided. So the DWP have responded in terms of now actually talking about job descriptions for the role. And obviously, as I mentioned in the slide, looking at the enhancement of the role, and they're going to increase the number of those Armed Forces Champions as well. And training is going to be part of that, because I think it comes down to staff training, as the question suggests, and making sure that all staff are appropriately trained.
Yeah, the question of who can train them, who's the best trainer to go in there and do it. I think we've probably got some evidence from the sort of veteran sector themselves.
So yeah, so we would absolutely advocate that the DWP should be working with the veteran sector to provide that training, and that people, you know, that it's not something that's done necessarily in-house. It should be something where people can come in externally and provide this training, or help develop kind of an online learning resource. There's we know that there's loads of training out there, and we know that there's loads of great providers that are in the kind of veteran sphere that can do this training. So we're kind of advocating to DWP that they need to be looking at what is out there and just adapting that. There's no point reinventing the wheel. They should be looking at what's there and adapting that to their particular service.
Absolutely. Could I move on to a question for Chérie then? It's the hidden veterans in the unique sort of environment of Northern Ireland. You demonstrated that they were hard to reach. Can you explain what you meant by that, and perhaps expand a little bit on the steps you took to mitigate any barriers to ensure you recruited the broadest section of veterans possible?
Yes, absolutely. So when we talk about the population of veterans in Northern Ireland being hidden and hard to reach, we say hidden and hard to reach because of all those kind of nuanced concerns around safety and security that is very present in our veteran population here in Northern Ireland. And I spoke about that a little bit in the presentation, but a lot of that came also from some of those initial interviews that we did asking what it's like to be a veteran living in Northern Ireland. And time again, we heard these concerns for safety and security as a legacy of the Northern Ireland Troubles. But not only in our veterans who had service in the UDR and the Royal Irish Regiment, but also in veterans who have more recently transitioned from various branches of the armed forces to Northern Ireland, because there's a legacy component around safety and security issues. So that's why we say that they're hidden and hard to reach. And also in those early days of discussing things with some of the veterans through the face-to-face interviews, we heard a lot of kind of conveying of a lack of trust for other services, so convey a lack of trust for healthcare providers. And again, all of this comes down to the fact that our veterans in Northern Ireland don't feel comfortable in disclosing their past military involvement. So therefore they're hidden and hard to reach because they're not overtly saying that they are veterans of the UK Armed Forces. So that's exactly what we mean. And then to mitigate against some of the barriers in terms of recruiting people to the studies, it was about, as I mentioned in my first answer, about building those relationships. So building the relationships and the trust with the service providers themselves, and almost taking baby steps in terms of doing bits of research with the veteran population and attending various events and coffee mornings and so on, and just letting the veteran community, you know, become familiar with us, understand what it is we're trying to do, and understand that what we're trying to do ultimately translates back into a benefit for them and their health and well-being. So it's all about trust and breaking down those barriers so that we can have access to a population that is hidden and hard to reach.
Yeah, trust I think is exceptionally important in your region, really. Meri, can I ask you a fairly quick question followed by a slightly more complicated one? The quick question is, how do people get hold of a hard copy of the Veterans Strategy and your charitable provision summary? How do they get hold of them? You'll need to unmute, Meri.
Sorry, certainly soft copies available from the government website and also the Forces in Mind website. There are hard copies held in the Ministry of Defence by the Covenant team, but depending whether there are people working in the building and therefore able to post them out will probably depend whether you're able to physically get a hard copy, but certainly that the copies will come from there.
And the slightly more contentious and harder question really that we've had was, do you think, or was anywhere in your conclusions or even perhaps in your thoughts, that we had too many military charities?
Well, it's a comment that you do hear made, and I think that it's made by people that don't really understand what makes up the number of charities. I did try and address it in my report, but I'm thinking of the more recent evidence in the report published by the Directory of Social Change last month, which maps the armed forces charity sector. And in that report, it finds that there are around 1,800 charities, which on the face of it, and if you didn't delve further, can sound like quite a lot. But when you start to unpick that number and you realise that it includes, for instance, 600 individual associations, all of which are charities. When about 300 or so of those are heritage or memorials or museums, well, straight away you're down to half of that number. And actually, when you take that down further to the number of charities that are delivering what people probably think of as a military charity, delivering welfare support and services direct to beneficiaries, you're actually down to 400 or so charities in that area. And they're serving a potential beneficiary population of 6.5 million. So actually, when you think of it in those terms, you might almost come to the point of wondering whether there are enough military charities. So no, I don't believe there are too many military charities, and the evidence doesn't suggest that there are too many either. And I think just finally on that point, that when people in influential public positions use that sort of line about too many military charities, that they should think about the consequences on the charity sector and the potential damage to the reputation of a sector that's working really hard to really support beneficiaries. So yeah, I don't think there are too many charities.
Well, I'm sure we would all agree, and unfortunately the too many charities is often attached to an equal slur about there being too much money sat in charities, which again we know is not true.
Absolutely.
Another question which I'll come to you all, but I'll start with Chérie just to give her a little time to think about it. The first part of the question is great videos from all of you, so that's very good. But what do the panelists regard as the key risks and the potential opportunities for further research in the veteran and families community? So it's sort of risks and opportunities, Chérie.
Yeah, well, in terms of risk, I know that the Veterans Strategy had outlined some concerns and some risks around accessibility of data and data sharing on veterans, and how we use that to try to do things like quantify the size of the veteran population. So I think that's a potential risk, and that's a piece of work that could be taken forward in terms of how we ease the access to data and data sharing. And that is mentioned in the Veterans Strategy, so that's at a higher level. In terms of things that we could do to take the research field forward, I'm actually going to pick up on a question that I can see related to that in the chat box, Mike, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the question asks if I think that there's scope to carry out research looking at moral injury in Northern Irish veterans, because they're unique in the sense that they've both served and lived in their area of operations. And I think that that's definitely an area that could be explored and taken forward. I think it's a really, really interesting concept in terms of the context of Northern Ireland, but I think it's really important that we do make the distinction between morally injurious events and morally injurious outcomes, and asking people, particularly people living in Northern Ireland, about those morally injurious events can have some very obvious complications. And we had originally tried to put a moral injury measure into the psychological wellbeing survey, but unfortunately we had pretty much a nightmare in terms of trying to get it through ethical permissions. So in the remit of everything else that was in the survey, we ended up taking it back out. But to look at the concept of moral injury in Northern Irish veterans would be fascinating. But even more so, I think any nation or any country who have experienced political violence, then I would argue that moral injury could be a concept that could be explored at the population level as well.
Mm-hmm. I would entirely agree. Meri, can you think of risks and opportunities perhaps in the charitable sector?
I think looking at that as a whole is thinking about the research that already exists. So we need to focus on sort of thinking about potential risks and opportunities. Is making sure that we are using and maximising the research which already exists. And there's a lot of great research in the sector already. And the example, obviously, the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre, Veterans and Families Hub, where the research is drawn together. I think using that research to be able to support the delivery by service charities is a great opportunity there to do that. I know also the COBSIO Research Cluster is an area where again, the coordination of research can try and make sure that the risk of duplicating something which has already been done is reduced, and that there's an opportunity for people to work together in producing research and using it to best effect. So I think those mechanisms should be in place there to reduce the risks, but really sort of make the most of what we can do with the research that's there to make evidence-based policy and service delivery.
That's interesting, and you need to hang on to some of that latter thought, because there's a question that'll come back to you later on. But Lisa, opportunities and threats.
Yes, to be honest, I think I agree with the points that Meri has made around resources like the hub, where they have these wonderful snapshots that bring together various evidence and provide you kind of overview of what's been written about particular issues. And I think they are a fantastic opportunity to ensure that we aren't replicating work and that we're actually looking at where the gaps are for future research. I guess I have an apology in a way, because I'm a social policy academic, and I specialise in benefits research. So I'm always going to say we need more research on the benefits system. And for us, it's been an area where there has been very little research, particularly in relation to veterans. There is a lot of research on welfare reform, particularly around universal credit, but very little that looks at veterans or their families. So obviously, I'm going to say that we should be continuing to look at that. But also, universal credit particularly, I think it's just worth me flagging up. I won't get on a big kind of discussion about universal credit and what it means, but because it's a kind of game changer in terms of the welfare state, and because it has brought together so many different types of benefits and the tax credit system within which covers now kind of, you know, that benefit system will cover millions of people, and more people of kind of different backgrounds than ever before. So I think it opens it up to conversations about how that might impact on families, spouses that might be claiming tax credits, or even if there are serving personnel, for example, on lower incomes that might be within that system. These are things that haven't been talked about really in relation to the benefit system.
Well, there's also, you're obviously both stimulating, or all three of you stimulating questions there, but there's one already lined up to come back towards that that sector in a second for you, Lisa. Meri, coming back to what you were saying, one of the questions we've been sent in is, given the current strain on charities, and that's obviously through the COVID crisis, what needs to change in the way that the government engages with the armed force or charitable sector? And I guess we could perhaps pin that down a little bit tighter to say government and COBSIO maybe?
It's a really good question, and part of the focus of the review that I did was to look at how that closer working between government and the charity sector could happen. Because the government just obviously really appreciates the valuable role filled by the charity sector. And I think one of the things that can happen is greater understanding of the issues and opportunities faced by the other. When I think about my own role working in the Ministry of Defence, it really gave me a better appreciation of the issues and constraints within government. So to see more of that collaboration, so perhaps to see members of government, local authorities, perhaps sitting on COBSIO clusters, as I know is starting to happen, so that they can hear directly from charities the issues that they're having and to see what they could do to support them. And equally, people from the charity sector having the opportunity to do a work placement, a secondment into government department or into Ministry of Defence, to be able to see the other perspective as well. So I think a greater understanding of each other's situation helps break some of those barriers down. And then I think that there could be ways, one of the things that I thought from my review was, if charities can be in a stronger position to be able to deliver contracts and pieces of work commissioned by government that need to be filled, because often the charities are very well placed, very well qualified, great expertise, but actually writing bidding contracts and bidding for pieces of work is very expensive, very time consuming, and often the charities don't have the resources to do that. So if there was a way of being able to fund more delivery by government through charities, then that could be a way of making charities more financially sustainable and also being able to draw on the expertise of the charity sector. So I think there's a couple of opportunities there in which the government and the charity sector could work more closely to be able to benefit the armed forces community.
Well, I certainly like the secondment idea, and you sort of exemplify that to the nth degree, really. So that's a fantastic idea. When we talk about are there too many charities, I'm going to turn to Chérie in a minute, because clearly Northern Ireland's a bit different. And although Meri mentioned 1,800 charities across the UK, there's a question here suggesting that there are only 19 service providers in Northern Ireland. Is that the same as a charity? I'm not quite sure what that means, but that's obviously per capita probably very different. Can you say a little bit more about that, Chérie? About the perhaps paucity of service charities in Northern Ireland?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, first of all, we have to understand the way in which we collected our data. So we did a desk-based review of all the available services for veterans here in Northern Ireland, and we did that across the statutory and the voluntary and community sectors. And we said that we had to focus specifically on services that met some inclusion criteria. And that inclusion criteria was that the organisation is funded to deliver a service specifically for veterans, that the organisation includes veterans in their aims, objectives, or their mission, and that the organisation has an individual or a department who holds a specific remit for veterans. So it's just to understand where we got that 19 service providers from, and there will be a lot more informal kind of service provision going on, but in terms of that more formal service provision in the voluntary and community sector, that's how we got the 19. But you're absolutely correct that, you know, per population head, England and Wales have something like 1,818, I think it is. In Scotland are 400 and something. So there's a lot more service provision going on. And also the thing that really jumped out for us here in Northern Ireland was a general lack of mental health service provision, which is quite surprising given the kind of socio-political impact that we talked about previously in my presentation and some of my answers that might actually relate to higher rates of mental distress or common mental disorders in our veterans here in Northern Ireland compared to places like England, Scotland and Wales. So I think that was a key finding there. That's very important, and again something which we hope has some impact and chimes with Meri's connection to central government in terms of working together and identifying gaps in the services. There are two questions here that are kind of linked, and I'll probably put them towards Lisa in the first question. There are two questions. The first one is what about GP training and their work with the DWP? Is there a gap in that in that service? And linking linking that is also addressing the status of good health in veterans. I'm not sure whether that's aimed at physical or mental health or both, but since, you know, being able to work and be employed and have a sound financial status and therefore housing is all linked to health. And is there anything to better link DWP with the health service?
So I think I wonder if the question is about whether the first part is that about the training that's being provided to GPs around the needs of veterans. Is that something that could be replicated to the DWP service? Because I think, as I mentioned before, we're aware of lots of training that's being provided to other parts of the kind of public sector. So local authorities, the NHS, they do receive training. And so we would say, yes, absolutely, that should be applied to the DWP service. The point that you make about how health, mental and physical health, is kind of treated and assessed within the benefit system is a significant concern to us. It is something that we flagged up that needs urgent review. I think some of this, I'm kind of zooming out to think about some of this. Actually, it comes down to some of the ideology and how we talk about the benefit system, some of the things that underpin what we think about the benefit system and benefit claimants, because in many ways that has led how we treat people. So when we assess people's health, we're kind of focusing on almost, it feels like to people, almost trying to trip them up, in that we don't believe that there's something wrong with them. We think they should be working. We're coming from a position of mistrusting people that are claiming benefits. And this comes back to the way that we've moved away from the social security system being that, about supporting people, about security for people during time of need, to people feeling like it's a stigmatizing system. So these health assessments of these assessments of functional capability are very much about that at the moment. It's about trying to make people move off benefits and into work, even if they're not ready. So what we want is a kind of urgent review of those processes. And again, it does come back to kind of staff training. The assessors that are currently undertaking those assessments, not all of them are suitably qualified to assess the mental and physical health needs of those people who have served in the armed forces. And actually, I could go as far as to say it's not just people in the armed forces, but other people who have got significant mental and physical health issues. These assessments have been shown to kind of not always be fit for purpose and appropriate for supporting people in terms of their benefits claims and ensuring that they're in the right kind of benefits claim.
Yeah. There's a quick fire round to end then. It's a question for each of you. I'll repeat it quickly so you can think a little bit about it. We want you to pick one thing from your research that you'd like to see happen. So it's the kind of the quick wish list, one thing that you could say, I'd like this to happen tomorrow as a result of my research. And I know Chérie saw that first, so I'll ask her the question. Quick fire answer.
Yeah, ultimately, I would like to think that our research results in better service provision so that the help can reach those who most need it here in Northern Ireland.
And Meri?
Well, so my report was really a summary, but the recommendation overall was that the UK government and devolved government should continue to support the armed forces charity sector. And I've talked about how that might happen, but it would be great to see that happen in terms of the support and trust in the armed forces charity sector, and to be able to continue supporting it to thrive and deliver and support the way it does.
Thank you. And finally, Lisa.
Yeah, I think similar to Chérie, I'd like to see the social security system be able to appropriately support veterans and their families, and to move to a position where the emphasis is not on the more punitive compliance side, where the emphasis is on supporting people, so that system never ends up in a situation where we actually exacerbate people's ill health or make people feel less worthy.
Thank you. One of the advantages of Zoom is that I can still talk while I ask everybody to give you an enormous virtual round of applause, which if you put your head out of the window, you can probably hear. So it just leaves me to thank you very much indeed, our 3 award winners. And I'm sure everybody in the audience now, if they didn't beforehand, fully understands why you're award winners. I need to thank the support staff from the communication group and my colleagues in the research centre. Now, we will be uploading this award-winning and webinar onto the hub. It would be remiss of me if I didn't mention the VFR hub. Those of you who haven't looked at it, I would hope this will give you some impetus to Google VFR hub. And if there are a few questions that we haven't answered, I know there are still some out there in the ether. With a bit of luck, we might be able to have those sent to our speakers and perhaps get a written answer. So it leaves me only now to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And thank you very much again. And one last round of applause for our speakers. And we hope to see you at our Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre conference in March next year. Thank you.